Thank you, Eric. Hi, everyone. My name is Nisha. Like Eric said, I'm a PhD student from UTSA. So today I'm going to talk about my work, the investigative study on the privacy implications of mobile e-scooter rental apps. So, micromobility. Micromobility is just, an umbrella term that you use to represent or denote a specific type of transportation option that you see in most of the urban communities. So micromobility essentially could be like people or battery powered. It could be docked or dockless. There are several types of micromobility that you would have encountered in most of the major cities, some including e-bikes, hoverboards, segways, and also e-scooters that you would have seen in front of the hotel, several of those. So a quick fact is that among all the micromobility types, e-scooters were the most used, at least in the US, up until 2019, based on NACTO's shared micromobility report. So you had more than 100 million trips just up until 2019, so it could be just even more than that as of now. So these e-scooters, they're available either for rent or to own. So most of these e-scooters, at least in cities like San Antonio, are available to rent by several service providers. So this concept of providing these e-scooters for rent was introduced in sometime around 2017. So how this 2017 came about is based on when the initial set of e-scooter rental services or the service apps were available in the Google Play Store or Apple Play Stores, at least to the general public. So if you kind of look at it, you have across over 100 unique service providers across the globe. Because of the pandemic, it may have increased or decreased. Overall, most of these service providers kind of operate in either multiple cities or even in multiple countries. And the one thing is that each of the service providers have their own apps. They kind of make available their own apps to the general public. And these apps, they could either deploy the same app across different countries, or they could choose to deploy different versions across these countries. So how do you essentially use this app, or for what you use this app is to essentially rent, like to start riding the scooter. The first step essentially is to scan the QR code using the smartphone where you actually install the app. And once you've done that, you can essentially start riding the scooter. So the problem here is that you have so many e-scooter service providers available. The problem is that if you're a user of more than one of these services, like one of the service provider could be like a Bird, Lime, and so on. If you're kind of using more than 2 or 3 services, there is a problem of data leakage between the apps, like the service apps, or from the service app to other apps that you have in your device. Another possible way the leakage happens could be via the API. So there are some service providers which use the same company to host their backend. So that's where the actual API to API leakage may happen. The most important scenario is that which happens offline without the user's knowledge, is when these services collect this information and share it with third-party entities. So these are 3 different ways that we actually think that data could be leaked, at least in the e-scooter service ecosystem. So to kind of study about, to kind of look into or identify these leakage scenarios, we kind of looked into the literature. As you know, as you can see, literature has like ample number of works just telling you how to identify all these sensitive data leaks and so on. And moreover, you have several tools which are publicly available just to analyze apps and privacy policies, like overall. But none of these four works had actually extensively focused on how data-related practices occurred in e-scooter rental services. So that is why in this work, we're trying to assess what kind of privacy risks may occur by using these service providers, at least these e-scooter services. So to go with that, so we try to have or analyze the practices followed by these service providers across 4 objectives. So in RO1, we try to kind of look into the user data that is being accessed or collected by these service apps. And in RO2, we kind of look into the third parties which are kind of associated with these applications. For example, if you have a Bird, so Bird has an SDK which, like for example, a Google Ads SDK. So Bird would be a first party, and your Google would essentially be considered as a third party. And then in RO3, we kind of look into the privacy policy document just to see if that users are adequately being informed about the practices that these e-scooter service providers kind of follow. And lastly, in RO4, we're trying to find if there is a trend across how these data sharing practices evolved since 2017 up until 2021. So to start the analysis, we essentially need a data set. So the way we shortlisted the data set is we specifically chose Android applications, mainly because of the open source nature of Android, and also we couldn't find any reputable repositories to download iOS apps. Another criterion we kind of used to shortlist the apps was that apps had to have English language support, because most of the tools that we used for the analysis did not support other languages. So that was also another criterion that we used to shortlist the app. Overall, we had analyzed over 102 rental services, which were there up until sometime around mid-2021. As I told you, we had like 4 objectives. For the first 3 objectives, we kind of downloaded or used the apps, the latest apps directly from the Google Play Store, mainly because Androzoo only had applications from the .com store. So if we had to download some apps from the European country Play stores, then that was not possible. So that's why we had 2 different data sets. So once we had all the apps downloaded, we kind of grouped them into 3 categories based on their download counts at the time of analysis. So any applications with more than 100,000 downloads would be considered most popular apps or service apps, and then anything with less than 10,000 downloads would be considered as least popular apps. So the analysis methodology. So the first thing, now that we had the data set, we had the apps, and then we also downloaded the privacy policies corresponding to the applications. So what we did is the first part, we're trying to analyze the applications. So the way we went about analyzing the applications is we applied several static and dynamic analysis techniques that we earlier saw. At least at a higher level, we monitored the API calls associated with the service application, especially during runtime, mainly to identify the user data points that we need to focus on later on. So some of these data points could be something from plain text strings, obfuscated identifiers, even SQL database files. So once we have that, we try to apply data and control flow techniques also available in the literature, either using the chosen tool set or manually. just to identify two different things. So the first part is identifying the user data related practices, and the second one is essentially identify the presence of third parties in these applications. And the next component that we analyze is essentially the privacy policy associated with these applications. So in the privacy policy analysis, we essentially try to find what type of information is available in these privacy policies, and do they sufficiently cover their data handling practices or not, or users informed of their rights related to the data and those kind of aspects. And finally, we combine all the results from the app and the policy analysis over time, and that's where we try to identify trends, which is in the fourth research objective, RO4. So all this analysis was done in 64-bit desktop computers and also on actual smartphones using the tools that you see on the table on the right. So among all the tools, policies was something that we used for policy analysis for all the policies that were not handled by policies, such as policy documents in different languages or in PDF format. We had done the analysis manually. And all the other tools that you see, apart from the highlighted ones, were used for the application analysis, the static and dynamic analysis, some of the tools like MobSF and Librera++ and so on. Most of these app-related analyses were done in two different platforms. So one on the actual smartphones, and then actually on the emulated environment as well. Most of these tools had limitations. That's why we had to put in human efforts to kind of analyze the service provider apps. Okay, so going on to discuss about the findings. So like I said, RO1 focused on user-related data. So if kind of look at it overall, there were three different categories of data that was being collected, at least by these e-scooter rental applications. So the first type of data was location data. So location data typically could just be GPS coordinates, but at least in e-scooter rental applications, we saw that location data was collected from multiple sources, not only from GPS coordinates, but also from other sources like cellular network and Wi-Fi identifiers and so on. So from a cellular network perspective, it's probably the location of the closest cell tower, and from Wi-Fi, they use your MAC address of the routers to essentially identify a relative position of your of you or the user. Another type of data that we actually saw that was being collected was identity data. So this identity data could be anything related to the physical identity of the user or the virtual identity of the user. So example of a physical identity would be something like a photograph of you, probably wearing a helmet or parking the scooter, and the virtual identity would be like information about you on social media and so on. So this information was either collected directly from the user during sign up, where the user had to enter the details, or like indirectly via APIs or the third-party libraries that you had in the app without the user's knowledge. And then the third type of data that was being collected was the device-related data. So you had like device either identifiers related to the data, device, or data that's actually stored in the device, like files, like SQL files, and so those kind of aspects. So how frequently the data was being collected varied across different of these data types. So you had the location data, which was the most frequently collected data, as frequently as every 15 to 20 minutes, and most of the time this location data was collected background in the background. And another type of data was identity data. It was only collected once, mostly either during sign up or sometimes occasionally you would have to give your data just for verification purposes. Another type of data, which was the second most frequently collected data, was the device-related data. So this data was actually collected whether the app was used or not, whether you had the app open or not in the background or not. So some of at least 1/5 of the service apps had collected device-related identifiers and shared with third parties, even when the app was not in use, as long as you had the app installed. So this data was being collected and shared. Looking into the data storage practices related to these e-scooter apps, we saw that more than 70% of these applications had both read and write access to external storage, but not all of them had used it. Among the apps that we analyzed, almost 3/4 of the apps had stored some information, either information related to the user, device, or service in clear text format, which is actually a vulnerability. This was mostly identified in the third-party library code base rather than the code base. Another thing that we also analyzed was third parties. So we identified third parties using two approaches. One is based on the presence of SDKs in the application, which was using tools like Androgard and Librera during static analysis. And another way that we used to identify third parties was using the domains with which it shared data or contacted during runtime analysis. So if you kind of look at it, most of the frequently accessed domains or most of the frequently used third-party SDKs were mostly related to data analytics and marketing-related libraries. And the most frequently sent data was device-related data, like either in a raw or combined format. When we looked into the privacy policies, at least what type of information these privacy policies had. At a high level, they had information about what data they collected, either very specifically or in a generic format, and also about third parties. What we also found that not all the policies had do not mention about the data did not have information about the data that they do not collect. So essentially, they did not have any do not collect phrases. Another thing is that we observed is that not all information about the third parties were very specific. For example, on average, we saw that across all the apps, you had at least 8 third-party SDKs that we identified during the analysis, but only the identities of 2 third parties were revealed in these privacy policies on average. And moreover, they did not have, most of the policies do not have any links or any detailed information about how these third parties handle data, like whether these third parties shared them with other third parties or how long they had kept data that was shared to them and so on. Luckily, there were some moderately popular apps which kind of gave you specific details about what data was actually collected and when it was collected and from who it was collected and to whom it would be shared and for what purposes it was going to be shared with. Also, when we tried to look into how similar these privacy policies were, we saw that the privacy policy had at least most of the content overlap with respect to the data types that are being collected, also with respect to the information related to the third parties, and most importantly, the statements regarding how they handle data or how they use data. The most significant overlap that we saw was in all related services. For example, Bird and Circ had like 99.8% overlap just because later on, we saw that Bird had acquired Circ, so they had essentially had the same privacy policies with just like a few terms swapped. So another thing that we analyzed was how readable these privacy policies were to different people with different educational backgrounds. So you kind of look at it, if it's the least popular apps, almost all least popular apps did not have policies within the recommended readability metric. So what this means is that the policies either had ambiguous sentences or very lengthy sentences or had like technical jargon which is not really in the commonly used vocabulary. So On the brighter side, comparatively, you can see that at least half of the most popular apps had policies within the recommended range. All it means is that these policies are essentially understandable by users even with limited technical comprehension or even limited English language comprehension. The setbacks that we kind of okay, so another thing, the major issue with these privacy policies is that they had a lot of escape phrases, in a sense which gave them a loophole to an autonomy over the data types that they collected. For example, they had like a lot of policies had generic description of what type of data was being shared with third parties. Like, for example, they said we may share information about you with third parties for certain purposes, but what is this information about you? We're not really sure. And then also less than 1/10 of the services do not specify they do not specify they do not collect this information. Essentially, what it means is like not a lot of policies tell that they do not collect certain information, so which makes it difficult to identify policy violations in this case, especially given the lack of information about the frequency, type, and density of data that's being collected and shared with the third parties. So we kind of looked into the updates or how the apps evolved over time. We noticed that somewhere near the GDPR and CCPA introduction, most of the privacy policy changes happened around that time, and the privacy policy changes were made to represent the provisions that were introduced in these particular laws. Another thing that we actually looked into was the vulnerabilities of the applications over time. So the most found vulnerabilities were like almost more than 85% of these services had third-party libraries which were associated with either insecure data storage vulnerabilities, or they kind of did not use sufficient cryptographic primitives. Essentially, they had information in clear text format and so on. Luckily, a fraction of the most popular apps had taken care of these vulnerabilities in the later versions. So that's a good aspect. And the last thing that we looked into from the evolution perspective was whether the policies or the services informed users about the data-related provisions that were available in the data privacy laws and regulations in that particular area or not. So one of the changes was related to notifying users about policy changes or not. Only 32% of the services mentioned that they would notify users when they change their privacy policy or not. Whereas another thing that was also there in the provision was related to access and deletion of your data, whether users can access their own data or delete their own data. This information was also present in privacy policies by almost 3/4 of the application services, which is also a good thing. The only thing that we don't know about is regarding the notification regarding data breaches, which was not available in most of the privacy policies, at least at the time of the analysis. So to sum it up, a lot of entities are affected by using e-scooter rental services. Like some of the users are affected, users like loyal users who have been using the service since 2017. And then also there's a lot of data that is being collected also can be used to infer several aspects about the users. So to conclude, we comprehensively analyzed several Android e-scooter rental applications and the privacy policies. Specifically, we looked into their data handling policies and all the third parties associated with them. And also we looked at how these practices evolved over time. So bottom line, if you're choosing to be a user of an e-scooter rental service, you may be at risk of several inference attacks where adversaries can infer your identity, possession, or what you own, and any information regarding your environment. So that'll be it. Thank you, folks. If you have any questions.
Thank you. I see there are a few questions in the audience, so I will now hand the mic to the first question.
Hello, great talk, thank you. My question is about, I think you found some vulnerabilities in this application. Did you try to reach out to the vendors? How did they respond?
No, not yet.
Thank you. Are there more questions in the audience? Yes, there are. But one more thing, you can also ask questions in our live stream. So on YouTube, there is a chat next to the live stream. So when you have questions you are watching online, you may also ask a question there. But now, next question from the audience.
So you said that they often don't specify which data they are collecting.
Yes.
Isn't this not illegal? So I think it's not complying with GDPR, and it's also not complying with the Google Play Store policies, which explicitly require to state this.
So they give you a general idea of what kind of information. For example, they say some policies say we can collect health information about you. This health information could be anything under the sun. So that's the loophole I was trying to talk about. If you kind of look at it from the data privacy law perspective, they do give you what kind of information they're providing. From a violation perspective, you need to know the exact data point, which is associated with it. So that's why I said it was kind of difficult to actually know whether they violated.
So legally they are like making it as vague
that's like
as
escape
possible.
clauses. That's why I mentioned escape clauses.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Are there more questions? No? Then there's actually one last thing I would like to know. As we know, we submit a paper to a conference, then it gets reviewed, then you prepare the camera-ready version, and then after a while there's actually a conference. That's what we're doing now. But since you submitted the paper, did something change? So are you still observing that? Do you know whether some new operators appeared, or whether some old operators changed the app, changed the policies, reacted to your research?
Yes. At least 15 to 16 service providers have gone out of business. Like, for example, Blue Duck is like not operating anymore. And most of the other services, I'm not exactly sure about the number. They've been taken over by other big companies like Bird, Lime, and so on. So they've acquired those smaller service providers in certain areas. Most important thing is regarding the privacy policies. So just after the CCPA, like at least 3 or 4 months after the CCPA was introduced, most of the privacy policies have more specific information about what kind of data they're starting to collect. But still, it's not very specific enough to know whether they're actually violating certain laws or not. Yeah.
Great. By the way, when a smaller company gets bought by a big one, could you observe what happens? Do they just kill the smaller app?
Yeah, they do not mention that, what they do with the data that they acquired from the previous service provider. So that's also something that we're not aware. At least they don't mention in the privacy policies.
But then the smaller app just gets killed, or do you see kind of mergers?
No. They just operate under the same name. It's just, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Then applause for the speaker again.